the world is going to explode, the world's going to go boom boom, and everybody's going to die. Biden and Xi apparently had secret talks that weren't known about until very recently around the war in Ukraine, where Xi would get things out of Biden and Biden would get things out of Xi for concessions on both sides. For example, something that the article is going to talk about, we're going to read about right now, is about how Xi asked Biden not to supply Ukraine with MiG-29s through Poland as long as Xi reels in the nuclear rhetoric from Putin. Obviously, it feels like that didn't really work too well. That wasn't very successful. So let's read the article. Let's see what compromises were met. Since the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, China has played a decisive, though publicly low-profile, role in strategic decision-making in both Washington and Moscow. As a report for the first time in my new book, Overreach, it was a back-channel intervention approved by Beijing that caused the U.S. to scupper a deal for the Poles to provide Soviet-made MiG-29 jets to the Ukrainian Air Force back in March. And since September, a flurry of personal diplomacy by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi with NATO and the U.S. has led to a rare moment of public agreement over Russia, when Xi Jinping said that the world needs to prevent a nuclear crisis on the European continent in a meeting with Joe Biden at a G20 summit in Bali. Throughout the war, China's true position on the Russian-Ukraine conflict has been hard to pin down, not least because Beijing has been telling both sides what they want to hear. In March, Wang implicitly appeared to be blaming the U.S. for stoking tensions and sowing discord with Russia. Last month, he told his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, that China will also firmly support the Russian side under the leader of President Putin to unite and lead the Russian people, according to state broadcaster CCTV. Wang also promised that China is willing to deepen contact with Russia's side at all levels. Yet in September, on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, Wang has told NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg that China stays open-minded to dialogue and exchanges with NATO, is willing to jointly promote the sound and steady development of bilateral relations in the spirit of honesty and mutual respect. So whose side is Beijing really on? The reality is China has consistently backed only one side, its own. But the illusion of Chinese support was one of the many miscalculations that led Vladimir Putin down the road to war. At a summit in Beijing on February 4th this year, Xi and Putin announced a friendship without limits with no forbidden areas of cooperation. But leaders declared this the new level of Sino-Russia strategic partnership superior to the alliance of the Cold War era. Beijing was aware of Russia's plan for military operation, according to a source with long-standing close ties to top levels of China's political and military leadership. But the Russians presented the coming military operation as a limited operation to recover a lost Russian province and reunite Russia within historical boundaries. That narrative fitted China's own over Taiwan, though it was made clear that Russia's operation must not interfere with the Beijing Winter Olympics, which ended on February 20th, 4 days before Putin's invasion. Most importantly, in a confidential annexee to the Friendship Without Limits was a mutual security guarantee that Russia had sought for China for decades, but hitherto been unable to obtain, said the source. Like NATO's Article 5, that an attack on one member is an attack against all, Beijing and Moscow pledged to come to each other's aid militarily in the case of a foreign invasion of their territory and if special conditions were satisfied concerning the cause of such an invasion. That extremely canny and present proviso inserted at the Chinese insistence would effectively exclude territories recently annexed during wartime, thus releasing Beijing from any commitment to respond to attacks on annexed parts in Ukraine. The scale of Russia's military operation in particular, the closely held secret of the Blitzkrieg attack on Kiev, of which even Lavrov was unaware as late as the 21st of February, took Beijing by surprise. Though the Chinese officially supported Putin diplomatically, blaming NATO for provoking the conflict, there was a deep and entirely well-founded concern that Putin had overreached and would provoke the West into a united front that a limited operation in Donbass would have avoided. Putin's threat of nuclear escalation on February 27th alarmed the world, including the Chinese. A key priority for Beijing was for the Russian-NATO confrontation to avoid any nuclear escalation and to help in reaching a ceasefire, said the source, who has regular personal contact with the leaders of the PLA. Now Putin had recklessly, in the eyes of the Chinese, played his dangerous card right at the beginning of the conflict. Wow. What the hell is this, this font change all of a sudden? What the hell happened to the fonts here? The fonts just changed midway through. What's this? Well, so, okay. Can I be honest? So, honestly, I think a lot of people oversell how committed China is to Russia. And people do it for any number of reasons. I think mostly because we just assume, like, this nation doesn't like America's strategic interests here. Therefore, any other person who has strategic interests that conflict with America, they're allies with them now. This is something you hear a lot when people bring up BRICS and they say, oh, look at BRICS, NATO's falling, BRICS rising. And BRICS includes Brazil, South Africa, Russia, India, and China. Now, the thing is with BRICS, though, BRICS is not a military alliance. BRICS could never be a military alliance. It would be impossible for BRICS to be a military alliance because BRICS goes between so many countries with so many different competing interests that aren't as ideologically aligned and or geopolitically aligned that it would be impossible for them to form an alliance. It's going to be hard for China and India to form an alliance when they have border disputes that lead to their soldiers killing each other in the last 100 days. Not in the last 100 days, but killing like soldiers in the last few years. It's going to be difficult for Brazil and China and Russia to form an alliance when Brazil also has a lot of interests with the United States, and Brazil is more in the backyard of the United States. Okay, you can walk by, it's fine. I think a lot of people bring up BRICS because by saying like there's this new alliance forming against the international order the United States has formed, you can get more attention, you can get more viewership, you can get more eyes on you, because being a doomsday profiteer is pretty profitable. That's why there's so many people talking about the end is near when it comes to nuclear weapons and all these other threats, because it's a lot more entertaining, it gets a lot more viewership to say the end is near than, well, it looks like that the international world order does have some competition, but let's also remember that these nation states have competing interests and they're not perfectly aligned. And so if Russia invades Ukraine, that doesn't mean China is going to be like right behind them, because China also doesn't like the nuclear threats that are going on, and China has its own concerns to worry about. In fact, China even has some conflicting interests with Russia when it comes to their territorial dispute. And then like once you get to that level, like that level of nuance is no longer, that's the reaction you're gonna get from people, because it's boring and it's not saying the world is gonna explode, the world's gonna go boom boom, and everybody's gonna die. It's not as spectacular. And I think that's why you'll see people like, for example, Jackson Hinkle or Jimmy Dore or Kim Iverson especially. Remember when Kim Iverson made the accusation that it was the United States and Israel that blew up the port in Lebanon, and their evidence for it was, well, they could have the motivation to blow it up to stop a Chinese economic deal in the Belt and Road. There was no evidence. Her only evidence was that somebody at one point blamed faulty fireworks, which she said was to pin it on China because China's known for fireworks. It made no sense. But she said it because it was spectacular. It was, whoa, it was the CIA in America? And nobody even listened to wait to see if she would actually provide evidence or put on the critical thinking hat. They just accepted it because it was spectacular and a lot more difficult than saying, a lot more entertaining and gonna get a lot more viewership than saying, hey, it looks like that corruption in Lebanon is so immense that even the most basic of maintenance could not be done. And it looks like that led to a disaster here, because corruption is a lot more boring than CIA, Mossad, espionage, terror attack. Not as spectacular, not as entertaining, and not going to get as many eyes on your reports. Westerners can cope all they want about Sino-Russian relations, but the reality is that China is making deals and has no interest in aligning with either side and taking advantage of any opportunity for mutually beneficial relationship. I don't know what you mean by like cope exactly, but China's out in it for themselves, and it would not be beneficial for China to send troops into Russia to defend their holdings in Ukraine that they've recently annexed. Right? It doesn't make any sense. Why would they care? Would they really want to see any sanctions expand to them? Would they really want to put themselves in the same bubble as Russia is right now with the amount of diplomatic isolation Russia is suffering right now? Would they really want to even expend the resources to do this when they're busy with their own plans of nation states they actually want to invade and try to conquer? It just doesn't make sense. They have other issues to worry about. And so the idea that they're going to like really stick their neck out for Russia here, outside of just like basically, you know, words of comfort here, words of comfort there, and maybe some diplomatic support on the international stage, China's not going to do anything. It's really not going to do anything. The most I could ever imagine is maybe small scale weapon sales. That's like the most I could imagine. So when a few days later, a further escalation threatened in the form of an offer by the Polish government to supply Ukraine with its entire fleet of Soviet-era MiG-29 fighter jets, the Chinese grew concerned. In truth, there was little likelihood of the Polish MiGs making much difference on the battlefield. Poland's 26 to 33 MiG-29s had been made in the early 1980s for the East German Air Force and had been sold to Warsaw for the symbolic sum of $1 each in 2003. Romania, which owned 20 similar MiG-29 jets, had decommissioned them many years ago. Nonetheless, a NATO country providing jets of any kind to Kiev represent an important symbolic, if not necessarily operationally significant, step towards direct NATO involvement in the conflict. Initially, Washington was positive, but a day later, on March 8th, the Pentagon abruptly reversed its position, pronouncing Poland's proposal not tenable. Personally, I don't know what we got out of them for this. I hope this we hear that we got a lot out of them for this. But 30 extra jets is significant, even if we're just getting the parts out of the jets for other jets. Definitely as Ukraine is trying to maintain or not even maintain, stop the Russians from gaining air superiority. And they have the Russian Air Force, like a significantly large Russian Air Force. I don't know what could have been offered that could make up for possibly like 33 jets that could have been given to Ukraine. I think it would have been I don't think it would have like changed the balance of the war, but it most certainly would have been helpful. What changed Washington's mind? In part, it was an urgent and confidential back-channel initiative led by the UK-based Institute for the East-West Strategic Studies, involving former European leaders and senior officials, and ultimately endorsed by Chinese leadership. Ever since Putin's 27th February declaration on nuclear readiness, the PLA had been reaching out through military to military, as opposed to diplomatic or political channels, to senior Russian general officers with whom they had made personal contact over a year of joint military exercise and military procurement talks. Beijing's aim was to ensure that even if there were a political decision to use nukes, the Russian army would insist on sticking to its long-standing nuclear military doctrine to use them solely if provoked by attacks on Russian soil. Though these unofficial Track 2 contacts, Washington and the PLA agreed, unusually given a deterioration in relations during the Donald Trump presidency, that if the U.S. stopped the MiG deal, Beijing's generals would do their best to defuse Putin's nuclear threat on an operational level. It worked, said the Chinese source. The U.S. decided that supplying the aircraft was a step too far. Now, okay, so, that is interesting. That's different than what I expected, because when I heard there was like a nuclear guarantee, I expected like, oh, the Chinese tell the Russian government that they wouldn't support them to use a nuclear weapon. But this is different. This is different than that. This is getting generals to talk to the people Putin would order to carry this out, saying, hey, if you carry this out, that's going to be a problem. You shouldn't do that. So this means this isn't even trying to convince Putin. This is trying to convince the people around Putin from the military sphere. This is going at it at a different angle that actually I think could be useful. More useful than 33 MiG-29 fighter jets? Possibly. I mean, it does make me more, I would say it makes me feel more confident. I'm already generally confident that the Russians wouldn't use a nuclear weapon. But I do think this puts China more on the side of us and trying to defuse the situation by making this deal. I think that this, honestly, I think this is justifiable. I went into this needing to be convinced, and it would have been difficult. I didn't think they were going to convince me. But I do think that if the idea is that you're not going after Putin's leadership, which I don't think China telling them not to do it would have changed anything. But you're specifically talking to the generals they've made contact with through their training with Russia. That's a different approach that just we can't pull off because we're the United States and we haven't been doing dual training exercises with the Russians. That is interesting. And I do think this could justify the lack of providing MiG-29s. If successful. The Chinese say they're successful, but the Chinese, of course, are going to say they're successful. Though this back-channel initiative of early March has not been previously reported, the fact that the U.S. retained a fundamentally cautious attitude to supplying strategic weapons to Ukraine throughout the war effectively confirms that Washington remained deeply aware of Chinese concerns, which were shared with many of the largest nations in the European Union. Despite a dramatic escalation in supplies of money and military hardware, including NATO standard 155 artillery capable of firing guided shells and the highly mobility artillery rocket system, HIMARS, NATO has held back on providing attack aircraft, helicopters, NATO standard tanks, and long-range battlefield missiles and cruise missile systems. At the same time, Chinese basking from Moscow remains equally cautious. Beijing offered diplomatic and informational support, but excluded significant military cooperation, forcing the Russians to buy drones from Iran, cannibalize domestic appliances for computer chips, and attempts to buy back helicopters, missiles, and missile defense systems from military customers around the world. I will say, there is a risk also that if we were to now go through with the MiG-29s or go through with the MiG-29 program or giving them aircraft in some way, that China could go back and say, you know what? If they're going to do that, then there's no reason for us not to sell drones to Iran or for us to not provide them with the stuff that they need for their economy to keep functioning as a wartime economy. Or you know what? Maybe we won't try to compromise them from buying back the weapons they've already sold. So I don't even think this could possibly only extend to the diplomatic pressure on these specific Russian generals. This could also extend, as they're talking about here, to all these other ways China could potentially support Russia. Man, I don't think this should necessarily extend to longer range missiles, which we should still provide, by the way. But I definitely see the justification for this now. This gives a lot of context that we just didn't see in these backroom talks. But I think this does shine a light on something that we don't talk about much. I don't think we've talked about much on the channel. But as we get news, a lot of times the full story doesn't become known until way after the news breaks. And I was super critical of the Biden administration for the MiG-29 denial. And I think most people had a right to be critical of it because it was 33 fighter jets being given to a nation that is desperately trying to stop the Russians from getting air superiority, which would mean they could bomb any hospital or military base or anything they wanted in the entire country. And that would be very, very bad since the Russians have a very, very bad tendency to kill a lot of civilians in the bombardments. So at the time, I was extremely critical of it. I know my community was extremely critical of it. Most of the people I know that are very pro-Ukraine was extremely critical of it. But now in hindsight, with all of the facts, I think I understand it more. But I mean, you can't expect people to not be critical of a move that looks like you're just not giving Ukraine supplies for it. You're giving no reason why. Now that we know the reason, in hindsight, I think it makes sense. I wonder if it was worth it. I mean, that's the thing. We might never know if it was completely worth it. And the reason we might never know is, like, let's say Russia doesn't use a nuke. Will we know if that was because of the Chinese attempts to pressure Russian generals? Will we know that that was the reason? Probably not. We can make guesses and we could say woohoo, it was, but there's also a possibility, and this would probably be true, that if they didn't make that pressure, it's still probably likely the Russians still wouldn't have used nukes. But this added an extra assurance if the government actually did try to go through with the order. My goodness. This really does add a lot of context that we didn't have, important context. Let's finish this article before we move on to the next one. Chinese energy giants such as Sinochem also suspended all Russian investments in joint ventures. In August, UnionPay, the Chinese equivalent of Visa and MasterCard, also ceased cooperation with Russian banks, citing sanctions. The material motivation for Beijing's cooperation to pull out of Russia was clear. Before the war, China did $100 billion in trade with Russia, rising by a projected $30 billion in the year thanks to increased oil imports, but more than $1.5 trillion with the US and the EU. True! And I said this a while ago, that at the end of the day, Chinese trade with the United States and the European Union is more economically significant to China than trade with Russia. And so the idea that they're going to stick their head out, if we're also applying strategic, we're telling them that we acknowledge their strategic concerns at the same time, there's like literally no reason for them to stick out their neck for Russia. There's no reason for them to take economic hits for Russia whatsoever. Why should China care about fucking Novorossiya? Why? China will fence ride until it's the last position possible. Yeah, you might call this a little bit like strategic hedging, You could call this strategic hedging, but I would rather China fence ride. Like, there's no way we're going to get China, unless Russia uses a nuclear weapon, completely on our side in Ukraine. That was never going to happen. Nobody was ever under that delusion. But if we can keep China from supporting Russia and continuing to, deny these types of sales to them, then I think that's generally beneficial in pressuring the Russian economy and keeping Russia from getting a bunch of new imports of weapons that they can use against Ukraine. With Biden and Xi's joint condemnation of the threat of nukes at Bali earlier this month, the so-called Track 2 understanding of March have become a one-track public policy. Thanks to Wang's shuttle diplomacy, NATO and China have effectively aligned on not escalating the Ukraine-Russia conflict, according to the Chinese source. Over a series of meetings with NATO leadership since early September, Wang pledged to use China's considerable leverage in Moscow to dissuade Putin from using nukes, while in return, it was affirmed that they would not provide strategic weapons to Ukraine. Strategic weapons. When you say strategic weapons, what exactly do they mean? Am I thinking of a different definition? Strike an enemy at the source of his military, economic, or political power. Ooh. But this includes long-range missiles, doesn't it? Ooh, but they need those. Dog. Planes are one thing, but planes and missiles? I feel like that might be a little much. That would be a good explanation as to why Biden hasn't sent them. That combined with the fact that Biden's afraid about that escalation. Yeah, no, this would be the perfect explanation as to why Biden hasn't sent the long-range missiles and the MiGs. Let me guys ask you a question. Do you think it would be more beneficial to Ukraine if we sent the long-range missiles and the MiGs if it meant China would basically be on Russia's side here? Because to me, that lack of unity between Russia and China on this issue is very, very valuable. And I don't know if 33 jets, and I would say 33 jets is not enough for that price. But 33 jets on top of long-range missiles that can decimate Russian logistics. Duh. I think honestly, stopping China from getting Russian logistics working again is probably too valuable. Even if we couldn't send the longer range missiles, we still need to find a way to get these longer range missiles to Ukraine. We need to find a way. fuck, man, because those things, again, I cannot emphasize how valuable they would be in damaging Russian logistics across Kherson and Zaporozhye. They could really help set up a counteroffensive. They could really help do it. You can smuggle them, but the problem with smuggling these weapons is that once they use those weapons, then what? Then the Chinese are going to see that, they're going to be like, you lied to us, and then what? I think China is busy with other stuff in order to risk anything helping Russia, like their protests and them still having to plan to get an invasion of Taiwan to work. Well, I don't think they're going to help them directly, like with, hey, we're sending our army. But they could get their economy, like parts of their economy which is really suffering right now. They can you can get it up and running again. Like, they have the ability to do that, and it wouldn't be tremendously difficult for the Chinese to do it either. It's such a valuable resource to not have Putin and Xi aligned on this. Why are those missiles so important? Can't drones do similar things? Well, number one, the drones are easier to shoot down. And number two, the missiles just go further and they're going to be more accurate. And so, fuck. I mean, like, Ukraine could try to make up for it, but the missiles are just going to be more effective in getting the job done. China's not delivering on the nuclear assurances, deals off. How do you know that? Wait, what was China's nuclear assurance? China's nuclear assurance is that it would pursue conversations with Russian generals and would tell them that they shouldn't do it even if Putin gives the order, which is something we don't have the ability to do because we don't have the ties with the Russian military like the Chinese do because of their long-term cooperation with the Russian military. Now, there is a problem about, like, how do we know they're not lying when they say, yep, we're good, don't worry about it? I don't know. I guess that's a detail that this doesn't cover. I think that's going to be like an intelligence thing. The Chinese can't do that either, so you think they're lying about this and we just fell for it? I find it hard to believe that the Chinese just was like, we told them and we were like, okay, and that was it. I find that hard to believe. There must be some confirmation here, some way that they confirm this. China knows that if Russia uses nukes on Ukraine, a non-nuclear armed country, the non-proliferation treaty is nil, and there'd be nothing stopping Taiwan from getting and developing their own. I don't know about Taiwan developing their own nuclear weapons. It would have to be the United States stationing nuclear weapons in Taiwan. That would be much more likely than Taiwan researching and developing their own nuclear arsenal. Putin found out and compensated due to the leak. It's over. It's out. What do you mean compensated due to the leak? How did he compensate? How do you know that, Parasocial Spark? How do you know the deal's off and it's worthless now? Obviously, if the deal's off and it's worthless, then we just give them the long-range missiles and the MiGs. But as far as I know, the deal isn't off. I mean, let's finish the article. Maybe they'll tell us the deal's off. At the Bali summit, backed by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, publicly called for a return to diplomacy and stressing the urgency in finding a peaceful resolution. That's a position yet to be officially embraced by NATO, which insists that the Ukrainians will decide when to come to the negotiating table. But many senior voices in NATO, for instance the US Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley and France's Emmanuel Macron, have independently suggested that Kiev should prepare for peace talks. And China's security guarantees of Russia's pre-invasion borders made back in February could play an important role in building a face-saving off-ramp for the Kremlin as a counter to NATO's likely security guarantee for Ukraine. China's price for peacemaking, but by the way, we can't return to pre-invasion borders if pre-invasion borders mean 2022 January borders. If it means 2013 borders, then okay. China's price for its peacemaking, Beijing hopes to improve relations with NATO and Europe and bring an end to a bloody and futile war that its ally Putin began so recklessly. In Ukraine, China is the world's is, in the words of in Ukraine, China is, in the words of the source, ultimately positioning herself as our last hope for peace in the world. The Ukrainians, who will likely be asked to sacrifice land for peace, may disagree. My goodness. This is an interesting, I like this art piece. I like it. I like it a lot. Man, this is actually a difficult choice. I can understand why Biden made the decision he made. And I actually respect the Biden administration more now. Fuck. God damn it. This makes my decision making more difficult. Why does China care about Ukraine getting MiGs? I don't get that part. I think they care about like Russia being like hit strategically, as in like Ukraine taking the war to deeper in Russia, because China kind of would have to step in and stop something if like Russia went completely awry, like if it started to collapse or something like that. Like they have to like defend Russia in a way. But it said that Russia and China have like a defense pact. What is I actually, this is a new thing. Is this true? China, Russia defense pact. Yeah, right before the invasion too. Huh. But this means that specifically China said under certain preconditions we would defend Russian territory, right? And so I guess there is a concern that China would feel that if deeper in Russia these long-range missiles and MiGs are able to strike, that they could maybe be used to justify Chinese intervention. I think that might be it. It's kind of silly, but I think I kind of get it. China wants to maintain the status quo above all. Ukraine having MiGs could disrupt the status quo by Ukraine being more likely to win. I don't know if that's it. I mean, I don't think China really cares if Ukraine gets its land back. So China wants to drag this war out as long as possible to weaken the Russian Federation and make them more dependent on them going forward. No, I don't believe that either. Because China could not. China with an extremely weak Russian Federation taking on Europe, America, Taiwan, like I think they still want a decently strong Russia if possible. I think that's part of the reason why they want peace right now, is because they want a decently they want a strong China. A strong Russia. They do want that. Anyway, even if I'm still milling over the consequences of these negotiations and whether I think the deal was a good deal or not, and I'm leaning towards probably was, God, what an information overload. That really changes how I think about the MiGs and the longer range missiles. We still need to find a way to get them longer range missiles, or a way to disrupt Russian logistics down south. And long range missiles is like the most clear like option. I wonder if there's anything we could point to while talking to China in negotiations that like Russia crossed the line here. We now feel it is appropriate for us to give them this. I wonder, is there anything we could do for that? I don't know, man. Honestly, I'm gonna like consume this information. I'll think about it for a while, and I'll get back to you guys about what I think, because this is really interesting. I might make a video about this. I might challenge myself, since I don't know exactly my opinion on it yet. So what do you guys think? Okay, let me give you guys two options. Okay, I want to get you guys' perspective. Okay, option one, you say screw China's concerns or whatever. We're giving them the MiGs and we're giving them the rockets. Fuck them. Option two, hey, it's probably more useful for us for China not to be supporting Russia with weapon sales, drone sales, and trying to stop them from, buying back their weapons and supporting them economically. And it's also probably beneficial for China to use its generals to communicate with Russian generals to try to convince them to not launch the nukes. So let's go with that. Let's not give them the MiGs and let's not give them longer range missiles. One or two. What do you guys think? I have a feeling what most of you guys are going to say. It seems like most of you guys are oneers. Site chat, come on, let me get an answer from you guys too. It's only Twitch chat responding right now. 11112212. 1. Push it and call the bluff. 1 from Sepsim, because we calculate the effects on the ground more consistently. That is a good point, that it is easier to calculate the effects of the missiles and MiGs more directly than it is to calculate the effects of Chinese holding back. I think it's difficult to calculate the effects when it comes to the nuclear weapons. I think it's easier to calculate the effects when it comes to the economics. And the economic effect of China not completely aligning with Putin is beneficial. You know what? I'm going to say 2. If you had to put a gun on my head, I'm going to say 2. Number dos. Can you explain 2 more? By agreeing not to send missiles and MiGs, China is not going to supply Russia with weapons. It's going to work to make it so that when Russia's trying to buy weapons back from nations it's already sold weapons to, China's going to be there trying to stop it. China's going to try to pressure Russian generals not to carry out a nuclear strike if given the order. And China's not going to prop up Russia's failing economy by like giving them the vital parts they need for their economy to function, like the airplane parts and stuff. But that means also Ukraine doesn't get long-range missiles, which they need, which would be not necessarily need, but would be extremely useful to disrupt Russian logistics down south. And it would also be extremely useful for them to have 33 more MiG fighter jets. And how useful on the MiG side? Probably less than the long-range missiles, honestly, but still helpful. Even if it was just for the parts, because they need to stop the Russians from gaining air superiority. I think the missiles are honestly more important than the MiGs at this point. Give them F-16s, that would just make it worse. That would make it worse. And also, Ukrainian pilots aren't trained on F-16s, so that would take a lot more time to really have an effect. And honestly, the Chinese reaction to that would be felt first than the F-16s. Unless we're training Ukrainians in F-16s in secret. Possible, who knows?